There were two very suited, dressed men that were standing at the fence, and they were very, men in black. So they're both standing there looking the same, very obvious. And all they said, all they needed to see was me to run out in center field, and they left.
Just another Little League game in Ypsilanti, Michigan in May 1973. Just another game, except these secret agent-looking guys are there to see if Carolyn King dares to take the field. Carolyn, who just a few weeks before tried out for Little League on a whim, tagging along with her little brother.
He was going to go try out for Little League Baseball, and I thought, maybe I can try out. I just followed him on my bike to Bowen Fieldhouse from where we lived, and he tried out, and I tried out. I went up to the table and I asked Mr. Anhut, who was the president of the Little League Association and one of the most wonderful persons on the earth, if I could try out. And he said, no, I'm sorry. Girls can't try out for Little League Baseball. And I went, okay, fine. I really didn't, no girls in Little League. And I turned around and he came up to me and put a number on my back. And before he did, he said, are you serious about trying out? And if you are, we'll place this number on your back. And he had such a spiritual family with girls. And I guess he would have hoped that his girls would have been given the same respect. That if you want to try out and you think you can, then do it.
Carolyn King, acting on a whim, decides to play baseball. Bill Anhut, acting on a whim, decides to allow it. Soon, much less whimsical secret agent types show up determined not to allow it. What followed was one of the Little League lawsuits, a wave of early 70s litigation aimed at giving girls access to baseball. Why have women's sports like basketball, soccer, and softball exploded while women's baseball remains on the margins? Carolyn King, now Carolyn King Lewis, discovered half of the answer that day when she looked toward the outfield fence and, instead of glimpsing cheering fans, saw serious men in dark suits who had come to stop her. Today, we look at this very curious moment in American history when baseball stood firm against including girls, even amidst a watershed expansion of athletic opportunities for girls and young women. And you want to know the weirdest part? It's not the men in black. It's the other half of that strange equation. That at a moment when the stewards of women's sports had all the leverage, they did not go to bat for girls in baseball. This is Uningrained. I'm Steve Hendershot. Uningrained is a show about blind spots, invisible ideas, and hidden assumptions, about identifying them, evaluating them, and when it makes sense, addressing them. This season, baseball is the national pastime, central to America's culture and identity. So when we say that softball is baseball for girls, are we boxing women out of an essential piece of American life? Come along and decide for yourself. And please subscribe, check out all of the bonus Uningrained content on Substack, and tell your friends. Thank you. This show only works with your help. Uningrained, Season 1, Episode 2. Our project today is to try to make sense of what happened to Carolyn King, who is one of several girls across the country who wanted to compete in Little League Baseball in the early 70s, but instead wound up watching lawyers compete against Little League Baseball. To do that, to make sense of it all, we've got to travel even further back and trace the evolution of sports in America along two tracks. On one side, you have big-time competitive sports, and on the other, you have the programs created by academic physical education professionals. These are very distinct movements with very different beliefs about sports and competition. We'll kick off the story not on the diamond, but at the Olympics. The modern Olympics began in 1896 in Athens. The founder of the modern games, Pierre de Coubertin, was French but very influenced by an American movement called muscular Christianity. It champions the idea that playing team sports instills character and virtue. That idea is so ingrained now that we could do an Uningrained season on it. But in the mid-19th century, this was fresh and new and different, just like team sports and just like the idea that sports were useful beyond fitness and entertainment. But at first, women were on the sidelines of the competitive sports revolution that flowed out of the movement.
Women are not fully embraced by this new sort of philosophy that also emerges in the 1850s, which is the philosophy of muscular Christianity. And it never quite impacts them in the same way that, say, it does men. It's because most girls are not in universities yet. And because the muscular Christianity movement, when it comes in the 1850s, 1860s in particular, it's going to impact Harvard and Yale and all those Ivy League schools in particular, and it's going to see a shift then from doing, say, gymnastics type training and exercise routines to a sport-based physical education system. And the girls miss that.
That's Jan Todd. She's a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, where she also heads the Stark Center for Physical Culture and Sports. So the Olympics arise out of the muscular Christianity movement, but muscular Christianity wasn't the only new game in town. There's also the budding science and profession of physical education. Team sports weren't part of the early PE formula, nor was the idea that there was a virtue or character-building piece to athletics. The point of PE was health and fitness, plain and simple, and the tools of the trade were weight training and calisthenics. And PE, or physical culture as it was known at the time, is more inclusive of women, especially at women's colleges like Smith and Vassar.
By the 1890s, we actually have women who have been hired here as people who are experts in physical culture. And again, it's this idea that you're shaping the body. You're sort of looking to see what are the defects and how would we perfect that.
As the name muscular Christianity suggests, at the beginning the movement had religious underpinnings, but by the turn of the century it was largely secular and very widespread. Teddy Roosevelt was a huge proponent, if not the most literal embodiment of muscular Christianity. A lot of the movement's tenets get fused into an ideal of Americanness. For example, these ideas permeate the writings of A.G. Spalding, the turn of the 20th century baseball executive we talked about in the last episode. The modern Olympics, though conceived by a Frenchman and hosted in Athens, are born out of this muscular movement. In several of the early games, tug of war is included as an Olympic sport. Women don't participate at all in the first Olympics. They're added little by little. In the 1904 games, for example, women only compete in archery. Their participation expands gradually to the point where in 1928, there is a women's 800-meter race on the track. And that goes oddly.
The women run well. They break the top 5 finishers break the former world record. And if you run an 800 meters, you know that it is the hardest event in track and field, along with the 400-meter hurdles, because it's aerobic and also anaerobic. It's the longest anaerobic event that you'll have to endure. And so, one of the women, also these are competitive elite athletes, one of them leans at the line to outlean her competitor. She takes a tumble, she gets back up. But the men who are reporting on that race come away as if it were a disaster, that there were wretched women like collapsing and all over the track and in a disgusting heap. And, they're trying hard and that's gross.
That's Victoria Jackson, co-director of the Great Game Lab at Arizona State University, where she's also on the faculty. And by the way, the scholars are ballers on this episode. Victoria is an NCAA champion distance runner, and Jan Todd was such a dominant powerlifter that in 10 years of competition, there was only one meet where she didn't equal or surpass a national or world record. That phrase Victoria used, wretched women, that's pulled verbatim from a New York Post article about the race. An 800-meter race, 2 laps around the track, seems like a straightforward thing to write about. But this story gets everything wrong, starting with the number of participants and extending to a claim that 5 women dropped out and another 5 collapsed at the finish line. Did not happen. But the article and the negative impression it represents made a huge impact.
It becomes pseudoscience, like, it must be unhealthy for women to run this far. Therefore, we won't let them run this far anymore. So scientists, medical professionals are claiming that it's harmful to women's anatomy, reproductive anatomy, to compete in distances. And it's over 200 meters. So the 400 doesn't return until Rome in 1960. The women's 5,000 meters isn't added until Atlanta in 96. It's a long history that takes us from a place of, okay, maybe we'll let the women try, to yikes, that was a disaster. And it's almost 100 years later that, we have women's events and men's events that are almost the same.
For a long time, that's as close as women got to the muscular Christianity-influenced world of sport. Meanwhile, within the movement, 2 team sports reigned supreme: college football and pro baseball. Baseball was an oddity because it mostly existed outside the educational system, but the growing influence of football in the early 20th century made clear the power of the movement. A survey in 1929 found that only 13% of college PE directors had majored in PE, yet 85% of them had played football. Around the same time, another survey showed that in 90% of American high schools, the PE director and football coach were the same person. So the PE people weren't in charge of the PE programs. But they did exist. They had their own movement, their own beliefs. Many of them were women. They looked for ways to do their thing in the margins. Again, they're focused on health and fitness more than toughness and character. And the PE folks mostly did this with their own set of sports and games, many of which they developed themselves, including basketball and volleyball, as well as some that they adopted, like softball. And they took an interest in a segment of youth that the football coach athletic directors weren't really paying attention to, girls. And they claimed the girls as their domain. Here's Jan Todd and then Victoria Jackson.
If you're in the gym with women, then those are going to be women who are training women. And that's a philosophy that begins to emerge. The physical education community becomes concerned about how much involvement should men have in deciding how women go to compete. Women educators begin to realize that they have to try to find a way to maintain control of that.
So you need a lot of women PE teachers. And so what great opportunity for the women of the world who crave these competitive elite sporting opportunities to major in PE. But there's a lot of concerns about preserving womanhood and ideas of femininity. And so these PE instructors are also kind of navigating the reality of creating space for the women students on their campuses.
What does that reality navigation look like in practice? Let's take basketball, for example, which quickly made the jump from PE invention to the competitive side. Women's basketball had to be different.
James Naismith is credited for inventing basketball at Springfield College. And just up the road from him at Smith College, there is a woman named Senda Berenson. And Senda Berenson is a physical educator there. So she goes down, she meets with them, and sees the game, talks to Naismith, and then she goes home, and she has to then figure out a way to sell this to the people who are running the university. And so she modifies the rules of basketball so that it's less vigorous. And so this is, again, this idea that we have to somehow save the vitality. We have to sort of, not overstress our women. And so, instead of playing on a full court or half court, she actually did the first rules for women's basketball divide the court into 3 parts. And so it's a very strange game. You only pass the ball. There's no dribbling. There's all these things that make it really not very exciting or physically, strenuous.
This becomes the playbook for how the women's PE movement engages with competitive team sports. A version of women's basketball that looked like men's basketball, but with women, wasn't going to fly. So Berenson made a different version that would go over better. She made a softer version. Hi, quick break to plug Uningrained on Substack. You've already found our main show, and Substack is where we go deeper. Deeper with extended play interviews that relate to each season's topic, and deeper in terms of Uningrained's broader focus on identifying and assessing blind spots, invisible ideas, and hidden assumptions, including how to address those issues in our lives and careers. Join our Substack community at uningrained.substack.com. Thanks, and back to our story. Back to Ypsilanti, Michigan, 1973. CBS News is reporting on Watergate and the end of the Vietnam War and Carolyn King's Little League career.
Walter Cronkite used to, and in Ypsilanti, Michigan, he used to do this. He followed me. I think it was trying to bring a bright spot. And for me, it wasn't quite a bright spot at that time. I think I remember saying to my coach at our first game, I said, I feel like a piece of honey with a bunch of bees around me. We had a full season of chaos.
Chaos, like the time Detroit TV journalist Doris Biscoe came to report from the field at one of Carolyn's games and encountered a Little League line drive.
she was standing on the sideline, and the umps are trying to get everybody back. Come on, step off the foul line, please. Step off the foul line. And she got hit in the head and it knocked her out. So here comes the ambulance. So that happened as well.
The main source of chaos was the friction between Carolyn's Little League chapter and the national organization. It came down to an ultimatum. Either Carolyn leaves her team or the league loses its Little League charter. Now, on one hand, this was not an existential threat. There are perks to playing under the Little League banner, but lots of youth baseball and softball happens every year through city rec leagues, independently organized leagues, or Little League alternatives like Pony Baseball and Babe Ruth Baseball. But one of the main perks of playing as a chartered member of Little League Baseball is an opportunity to compete to play in the Little League World Series, an opportunity that, in 1973, was primarily for 12-year-olds. Carolyn's league had a lot of great players who were dreaming of making it to the series. So losing the charter, it wasn't a sideshow for the other kids. It was deeply personal and bitterly disappointing. Carolyn felt that pressure in the moment back in 1973. And not just pressure, but empathy.
I even asked my teammates if I could quit. I said, I'm really fearing that, I'm impeding on your year, and this is not good.
The league was going to allow her to quit, and then the mayor stepped in. George Goodman, whose grandfather played pro baseball in the Negro Leagues, said if the league was going to use city facilities, then Carolyn had to play. So she played. The league lost the charter, and the kids lost their shot at the Little League World Series.
Oh, they were mad at me and still are. I mean, seriously, I'm on the tail's end of 65 right now. And it's so funny that I can still reach out and they're going, we don't like you. We lost our opportunity, because they did have a good opportunity to win. And remember, I went through all of junior high school, and then see them at 40-year reunions. These people are still my friends, the people that I played Little League Baseball with.
By the middle of the 20th century, the two movements driving athletics in America had turned into two distinct operations within colleges and high schools. The athletic department, which oversaw competitive sports, and the physical education department, which was academic. The people on the PE side, especially those working with women, tried to keep their heads down and do their thing without calling attention to themselves. And among the unofficial core tenets of keeping your head down was not trying to take on the two biggest sports, football and baseball. Here's Victoria Jackson.
Even if they want their girls to be able to play baseball, they realize that they're going to face resistant cultural headwinds if they go all in with that. And if it's a little bit softer, and maybe we'll get less of that resistance to play softball, then you're like, yeah, let's start a softball team instead. So that's really how softball becomes the stick and ball game for women in colleges to play by the 40s, 50s, 60s on university campuses.
So the first part of the answer to the question, why didn't anybody create women's baseball, is that women's sports leaders specifically avoided it. There was an intentionality about not taking on the national pastime and instead embracing a more culturally palatable alternative. There's also ideology around physical education generally, and women's physical education in particular, that runs directly counter to some of the principles of muscular Christianity. They're not especially interested in seeing young people's character forged in the fire of intense high-stakes competition, and they really don't like some of the side effects of an overheated sports culture like the 1919 Black Sox gambling scandal.
The matter of competition, what evolves as part of the philosophy of these early women physical educators is that part of the reason that we don't want competition for women is because it's important for girls to have more of a sense of community. In other words, that everybody should win.
This philosophy gets codified after First Lady Lou Hoover leads a conference in 1923 that charts a very specific course for women's physical education.
The decision that comes out of there is that the dominant pedagogy going forward for women's physical education in America, which also will impact what we do with competitive sports, is that women should not have to compete. that there's something about being involved in competition, maybe because there might be gambling involved, maybe because it causes women to try too hard, to be too, we might get unruly in various ways if we actually have competitions. I mean, unruly women are never something that they want.
I want to underscore what Jan just said. The dominant pedagogy for mid-century women's physical education in America is that women should not have to compete. Sure, the PE professionals are keeping their heads down, but also armed with this ideology, they're not really jealous of baseball and football. They look down on them as misguided, impure. Instead of trying to fill stadiums with screaming fans, these leaders are organizing play days. Here's Victoria Jackson.
Play days were these it's like when you have field day in elementary school and you just kind of play a bunch of things together and you don't really keep score. And it's with these play days, it was often multiple women's colleges or universities that had desegregated by gender recently coming together. And then there'd be like tea and cookies after. It was like a social event.
So in one lane, we have the PE movement, living healthfully, enjoying tea and cookies after a lovely day of unscored, organized movement. In the other lane, there's competitive sports, growing ever bigger. People gradually forget the phrase muscular Christianity, but its ethos took root deep in the American psyche. Team sports aren't just about fitness, but character, toughness, striving, resilience, hard work. To quote Tom Wolfe, they instill the right stuff. Those aren't just ideals for college kids. Those are youth ideals, too. People wanted those experiences for America's youth, but PE classes weren't teaching this stuff, so where were the kids supposed to pick it up? Community-based youth baseball and football programs, often led by parents rather than professionals, filled the void. American Legion Baseball starts in 1925, then Pop Warner Football in 1929, then Little League Baseball in 1939. And even without the sheen of scholarly approval, these programs took off. 25 years after its founding in 1964, Little League received a federal charter charging the league with responsibilities right out of the Muscular Christianity Handbook to assist boys in developing qualities of citizenship, sportsmanship, and manhood. Youth sports reach the big time, and it mostly happens outside the PE establishment. It mostly happens without including girls. But the girls do notice, and the PE instructors start feeling the heat from kids who are not satisfied with play day.
Elite athletes really didn't like them and wanted to play against each other. PE instructors start kind of organizing regional networks. And there's like an alphabet soup of women's sports organizations in these middle decades of the 20th century, which then all lead into the Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women, which commences championships in the 71-72 school year before the passage of Title IX. And so by 1970, that system in which schools are competing against each other is very robust.
So the AIAW kicks off in 1971 as a sort of women's equivalent to the NCAA, the National Collegiate Athletic Association, the body that governs football and basketball, but with very different values and aims. After all, the PE people are in charge.
It is unlike the NCAA, though, in that these women are educators first. And they are not part of the athletic department, which by this time is being operated like a business. It's why they think scholarships are pay for play, and it takes women students suing to be able to get athletic scholarships for the AIAW to change their rules around that. There's even more resistance to the business growth of women's sports because of the kind of educational value that these educators see. So there's tension there.
We've almost reached the crucial moment when girls and women's baseball might have taken off. Girls want competitive sports. They're about to sue for the right to play. But what's the landscape? First, the baseball establishment doesn't want them. Here's Victoria.
Baseball, at that top of the pyramid in the professional space, starts pushing out girls and women and becomes a manly game, and the sport in which kind of men prove their manliness and kind of all of the ideas of manhood really grow and develop.
But that's only half the riddle. Just as important is that the people holding the keys to women's athletics at this crucial moment in history didn't really want baseball either. They're opposed to overheated competition, opposed to any hint of professionalization. They're wary of corruption. So when the big moment arrives, the leaders of the PE movement look at their opportunity in baseball, shrug. Hey, it's Steve. I want to tell you about the other Uningrained podcast, Uningrained Extended Play. Extended Play offers extended versions of the interviews you hear on Uningrained. Each episode is still edited, still about half an hour, but these are conversations with one guest. To listen, subscribe to Uningrained on Substack at uningrained.substack.com. Then listen on the Substack app or grab the link and listen in your favorite podcast player. Thanks, and back to the story. This episode asks why women's baseball didn't emerge in the early 70s when so many other women's sports did. The Little League lawsuits seem like such a natural spark to light that fire. But the reason we've spent so much time on college athletics is that when Little League goes to court, this arm of institutional baseball takes its cues from college athletic departments. During the era when the lawsuits were filed, those colleges were trying to come to terms with a new law called Title IX. The original text of Title IX said no one could be excluded on the basis of sex from participating in any education program receiving federal money. Not a word about sports. But people on college campuses saw the implications. Universities took lots of federal money, and many of their competitive sports programs excluded women. President Nixon signed Title IX into law on June 23, 1972, less than a week after the Watergate hotel burglary that would ultimately take down the Nixon presidency. But the law was super bare bones. 37 words, and its passage kicked off a years-long process to work out the details, such as an exemption for contact sports. After many decades of mostly ignoring one another, this process forced the competitive sports people and the PE people to sit down at the same table.
You have two different groups of people in leadership positions on university campuses that are part of the force of movement away from baseball to softball. The first I mentioned is the women's physical educators and their concerns about creating spaces that aren't going to be outright resisted for their women students. The other is the athletic department itself, which is a male space. It is all dudes for its first 75 years. And, their priorities are American football. And they hire men who think like them. And they think of sport in a very narrow-minded way because they never thought to provide opportunities for women in sport. That they just allowed physical educators to do that on the academic side of campus, right?
The establishment sports dudes are trying to figure out how to comply while avoiding detrimental effects to their football empires. The PE women are preparing to scale up their side of the shop using their existing toolkit, which includes softball and does not include baseball.
The law passed, and they had something they could point to get more resources for the programs that they were already growing and developing. And so it is a grassroots story that softball wins out over baseball because, again, it's these physical educators who are building these women's sports opportunities. Team sports really take off and begin to grow by the 1960s. And at this point, you've got volleyball, basketball especially, and softball as the three primary team sports for women at the collegiate level.
When girls sue for the right to play Little League, Title IX is driving the bus with regards to the larger conversation about gender and competitive sports. Everybody's watching the colleges to see what happens. But Little League matters too. I mentioned Little League isn't the only national youth sports or youth baseball program, but it is special. There's the federal charter, there's the brand name, there's the lineage, a list of board members and trustees that not only includes Major League Baseball executives, but also Walt Disney and J. Edgar Hoover. This organization absolutely plays as a full-fledged custodian of the national pastime and the big-time sports establishment. There are several Little League lawsuits filed across the country, and Little League makes similar arguments across the different cases, including claiming that baseball is a contact sport, which is an argument whose relevance comes straight from Title IX. Not all of the arguments have aged well. Jennifer Ring is a professor emeritus at the University of Nevada, Reno, and author of a couple of books about women in baseball. I'm just going to hand her the mic and let her summarize some of Little League's contentions, which now play mostly as comic relief.
It was just astonishing. Let's see, Little League Baseball argued, first of all, one, this is just at the beginning, is if you had girls on teams, how could the coaches pat them on the butt when they did something well? That would be very unbecoming. You can't have grown men fondling young girls. And, which of course made me think, well, do you want them fondling young boys? Maybe we have bigger problems than bringing girls into the mix. And another one is the most absurd one was that if a girl got, this is almost a verbatim quote. I could look it up, but it's close enough. If a girl got tagged in the boob by a baseball, the abrasion would be likely to cause breast cancer. And this language is in the court record.
Little League also argued that baseball was a contact sport, trying to grab hold of the Title IX exemption that was in the works for universities. It's interesting, the exemption language refers to bodily contact, so the most dangerous aspects of baseball, getting hit by the ball, aren't in play. But there can be collisions on tag plays, and Little League makes this argument, along with arguments that girls are more fragile and that it's especially important to protect their appearance compared to boys.
Little League Baseball was saying girls' bones break more easily than boys' bones. So in a collision, a girl is likely to get hurt much more. And this was, yes, coupled with the fact that we've got boys getting broken noses and teeth bashed out and scars on their legs. And that's okay for a boy, but you can't have a girl disfigured like that. It'll ruin her chances for marriage and, yes, childbearing. So the physician for whichever professional basketball team it was said, no, it was actually the opposite, that boys' bones break more easily than girls' bones. I mean, it was just every argument, every pseudo-medical scientific argument was shot down.
Then the arguments got social.
And the arguments started shifting to the problem isn't really that girls will get hurt. It's that if girls are on a team, and this was another verbatim argument made in court, that it would be bad for a boy's ego if the girl on his team was better than him, and that his teammates would tease him and say, ha, you got beat by a girl, you got struck out by a girl, and that would be bad for the boy's ego. And you just can't expose American boys to that kind of threat.
And there's an adjacent argument that boys benefit from all boys' spaces, and the same with girls and all girls' spaces, and thus those, in some cases at certain ages and to some extent, are worth preserving. The phrase islands of privateness makes its way into the court record. This argument, to me anyway, is the most compelling. Far from a slam dunk, especially at the ages we're talking about, but it's not an argument against girls' baseball, which Little League could have spun up at any time. It's an argument against co-ed baseball. Eventually, Little League loses one of these cases. Not Carolyn's, but one in New Jersey, where the plaintiff was a girl named Maria Pepe. The hearing officer on the Pepe case wrote, "The institution of Little League is as American as the hot dog and apple pie. There is no reason why that part of Americana should be withheld from girls." And now Little League had to do something. Girls had sued for the right to play baseball, they had won, and now Little League had to let them play. So it's either co-ed baseball or girls' baseball, right? Not so fast. In January 1974, while the Pepe case is pending appeal and Little League is still holding the line on co-ed baseball, Little League instead announces a new program designed for girls: softball.
That still begs the question of, where's the baseball? Why couldn't they have come up with a separate girls' Little League baseball program? And so it looks like it is a willful effort to save this one sport for boys and men, to associate it with American boyhood and manhood.
At first, Little League softball was slow pitch, not fast pitch. The players wore short shorts instead of baseball pants, which was an odd fit with the court argument about how it was especially important not to scar these young women. But seriously, how did they get away with this?
This is as crazy as anything else, except I think the nation has bought it.
When institutional baseball took a hardline stand against girls' participation, there was no one to advocate for girls' participation, in baseball at least. The women's sports establishment was firmly on team softball. Not only was it disinclined to go to bat for baseball, it didn't even like baseball. Baseball and football belonged to the wrong-headed sports culture on the other side of the athletic department. The smarter side, the educated side, the PE side was softball all the way. Besides, girls and women's fast-pitch softball already existed. The history of softball is the focus of our next episode, but when this is all happening, a West Coast organization called Bobby Sox Softball had already proved the viability of youth softball, and some Little League communities were already offering softball independently. Offering softball that January did not satisfy the courts, which months after the softball announcement continued to demand that Little League open its baseball dugouts to girls. Finally, in June of 1974, at the tail end of the Little League season, Little League complied. That's what opened the door for the world that we looked at in our first episode. But in practice, that move to offer softball first, several months earlier, worked like a charm. So many girls who might have played baseball instead agreed to sign up for a different sport, playing with other girls, whether or not they wanted to. We're going to end with Carolyn King Lewis. Over time, Little League cultivated a relationship with Maria Pepe and has celebrated her as a pioneer. But Carolyn, all she got was a letter in 1974 inviting her to play Little League softball.
Yeah, they asked me to play. They sent me a letter, and I think I still have it down in the basement. But my dad thought it was more of a dig than it was an offer to play. That it's more of a, well, you can come along with here because now we've got this league, and you could never say there wasn't a league that was available to girls. I wasn't interested. I was at that time I felt like my family's name was soiled by Little League by not acknowledging the fact that I was just a kid. I was just 12. No, I think it was more about challenging me, Carolyn King, that I hadn't been, basically they didn't think I'd been challenged enough and I needed some more, and here you go.
By the following spring, Carolyn was too old for Little League. She thought about going out for Babe Ruth baseball, but she worried there was going to be another legal fight and she wasn't up for it. So she gave up. Eventually, she played high school softball and rode the bench for a coach who mocked her with the nickname Superstar. This episode of Uningrained was reported and produced by me, Steve Hendershot. Thanks to Nathan McDonald for his help with all things visual. Lots of research informed this episode, and a list of those sources will land on our Substack soon. That's uningrained.substack.com, along with a separate podcast called Uningrained Extended Play that features longer, more conversational versions of some of our interviews. Your help in sharing and promoting the show is very much appreciated. Thank you, and please keep it up. Uningrained is a production of Cedar Cathedral Narrative Studio.